Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Tom Sarrouf, and my guests today are Philip Booth and Andre Alves, who are the authors of this new book, Catholic Social Thought, The Market and Public Policy, 21st Century Challenges, which is out from St. Mary's University Press. And yeah, we're talking about economics and theology, specifically Catholic moral theology, and very excited to have this conversation. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to start with, I think, a conceptual debate that frames this book, and it comes to me by a way of a debate between, not a formal debate, but a sort of debate of writing between Catherine Pacolic and Mary Hirschfeld on whether economics is a distinct science or branch of knowledge, or if it's more of a species of moral theology. And I think the kind of frame that as a question for you guys is what role should theological truth and social doctrine play in economic science and thereby in economic policy making?
Well, I was quoted in The Economist a little while ago as saying that thinking about economics without considering ethics is a bit like teaching about sex without thinking about ethics and concentrating only, if you like, on technique or the science of it. And I think that's quite a good way of looking at it. You know, there are particular things where the economist can contribute, and there are particular economic problems where you can, if you like, assume away the ethical and moral difficulties. You know, if you could develop theories of options pricing or futures pricing, or look at how the demand and supply for labour combined with a minimum wage might affect unemployment, without necessarily confusing the analysis, if you like, with ethical thinking. However, if you're going to then relate it to economic policy, or indeed going to make normative judgments, or try to understand human behaviour and economics in a more general and holistic sense, we do need to be able to tie it in to an understanding of moral behaviour, also an understanding of human nature, and we would argue that that requires some understanding of Christian anthropology. You know, the fact that we are made as imperfect beings, therefore we don't have perfect foresight. You can't create somehow a system of government to centrally plan the economy and expect good outcomes, because the individuals who will be conducting the central planning process will be flawed, both in terms of their ability to know what they need to know to centrally plan, but also because they'll be tempted by evil, they'll become corrupted, and so on. And all of these things are relevant to economic policy debates, but also economic decision making. You know, if you're a business person, you can use good economics perhaps to try and understand your market and how to recruit employees and how to set salaries, but that doesn't tell you what it's right or not right to produce ethically, or what are ethically correct or incorrect ways of producing what you're producing. So yes, there are certain things where economic science has been really helpful in to give us a better understanding of a wide range of problems, but then no, that's limited in what it can do, what it can achieve.
Yeah, I would add that it's also important in terms of the distinction between goals and means. So economics as a discipline and as a scientific field certainly has a lot to contribute in terms of choosing the right means, choosing the right techniques, and certainly it's highly problematic even if people who are guided by the right goals, by the correct goals, by the right moral purposes neglect economics, in the sense that they may then for example, support public policy, which, although well-intended, will be ultimately detrimental to those same moral goals. At the same time, and looking at this the other way around, and I would say in the contemporary Western world, which is in many places highly secularized, this is also another kind of problem, is just focusing on the means, sort of from a absolutist utilitarian perspective, which unfortunately is often dominant in contemporary business ethics. So you just look, if something produces overall net utility, then it's a good thing. If not, then it's a bad thing. And if you use that yardstick as your ultimate moral standard, then you're also into another kind of problems, because then, of course, just look any justification based on utility without regarding the moral appropriateness of the goals and of the very same means that are employed will raise all sorts of problems. So I would say one of the things we try to do in the book, and the essays from different authors cover different aspects of this in the book, is having a proper consideration for the valuable technical contributions of economics. They should not be disregarded. They are very important. But at the same time, having this guided by an overall moral framework, bearing in mind the common good, bearing in mind the moral judgment of the means that are employed and so on, so that this technical dimension is not sort of made absolute over all of economic action and business action.
Excellent, both of you. That's a great start. My next question is, what is Catholic social thought or Catholic social teaching? And also, I guess, a corollary to that is, what is it and what is it not? How about Andre, you start this time.
Okay. I mean, you'll have different well-informed people giving you somewhat different definitions. So I'll provide my own interpretation of them. I think in a stricter sense, we can talk of Catholic social doctrine, and this being the teaching that is more formally attached to formal documents by the Church, right? And often there is a connection, and this is a sort of very timely topic with Pope Leo, a connection with Rerum Novarum. So Rerum Novarum often being referred to as the first quote-unquote social encyclical in terms of being structured around Catholic social teaching. I think there's some merit to that, but at the same time, another dimension that we try to emphasize is that this more formalized Catholic social doctrine should be regarded as part of a much longer tradition of Catholic social thought, which goes back to the early beginnings of the Church, then has very important developments in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, in the Scholastic and the late Scholastic period. And so there is a continuity, as in other aspects of the Church, there is a continuity. Of course, there are changes, there's evolution, but it's not, I think it's a mistake. It's a mistake to look at Catholic social teaching as something which starts in the 19th century with a specific encyclical, even though that encyclical is certainly extremely important, and we should devote more attention to it, actually read what it says. It's often misquoted in many aspects, but I would differentiate between these two aspects, these two interpretations. So we can look at it from a more formal perspective in terms of church documents, but I think it's also useful to consider a broader tradition of Catholic social thought, which has evolved for a longer period of time, and then should hopefully inform the more formal developments that occur over time.
Yeah, and indeed that period of time stretches right back, of course, to the Old Testament. It's not merely the Church Fathers or Aquinas, the late Scholastics, but right through to the Old Testament, and that's particularly relevant, say, to the issue which perhaps I can use to illustrate a point. So, an issue which often comes up here is what is the authority of Catholic social teaching? So the Church has a clear understanding of its own authority on the teaching on moral and theological issues. So if you go to the church's documents, you'll get a very clear understanding of what the church believes about the assumption of Mary into heaven upon her death. You'll also get a very clear understanding, moving on to a moral issue, of the fact that it's wrong to kill, deliberately kill an unborn child in the womb. So does the same level of authority attach to the church's social documents? Now, there is some debate about this question, I should say, but I think the more or less settled answer is that when the church is making moral judgments through those social teaching documents, then yes, the same authority applies. So if the church says that the employers should treat their workers well, do everything they can to ensure that they are justly paid, ensure that they have time for religious observances, that's part of the moral teaching. But then social teaching documents tend to move on and make what are often called prudential judgments using that virtue of prudence, and on questions, say public policy questions. So you have the issue of the church would like every employer to pay a living wage, enough for a man, as it was when the idea was developed, to from full-time work to keep himself and his family. So there's then the question of how best to achieve that. And the church does talk about things like state-mandated minimum wages. It does talk about the moral obligations of employers. It might even, although I don't think it has, but there's no reason why it shouldn't, then also talk about the costs which the state imposes upon families, such as through housing policy, which raises the cost of housing, or policies which reduce the availability of jobs and so on to workers. And they fall really in the realm of prudential judgments. We don't say that these are moral and theological issues on which the church teaches with dogmatic authority. So so you might well find these kinds of judgments about how states should develop policy, say to do with financial regulation or the treatment of the environment and this type of thing, within social teaching documents, but they're not necessarily designed to give definitive answers to these policy questions. And that fact alone, I should say, is stated within the documents, that judgments are made within documents on matters where those judgments are necessarily provisional and not necessarily final, and they may only hold in particular circumstances, because different approaches in different circumstances might also be appropriate.
So if I understand you both correctly, then Catholic social teaching is a sort of moral outline, but not necessarily a specific policy blueprint. Mm-hmm. So there are some things that are clearly out of bounds because they contravene moral precepts and teachings. Something we could probably talk about is usury. That's like a clear economic issue, which, as I understand it, is banned by Catholics, or like Catholics cannot practice usury. But like Philip, I think you mentioned as well, as like abortion, euthanasia. These are like clear things that contravene the moral law and Catholic teaching. But as to the particular policy instantiations, that's where economic science can come in, and there's a matter of interpretation and prudence needed in this particular circumstance. Is that?
Yeah, the classic example there is Thomas Aquinas and prostitution, which probably Andre can explain better than I can, as he's more of a scholar in that area than me.
Well, yes. So the reasoning being that, and picking on the question and on Aquinas and prostitution, which and the rationale applying to other areas as well, is Catholic social teaching will say some things are definitely out of bounds, and it will also say additionally that some concerns, some moral concerns, definitely have to be there. Right, so it's not just a negative prescription saying some things are absolutely out of bounds. it also has some positive elements in the sense that an employer, an employee, um, member of a family has to have certain moral concerns and certain a certain moral framework when deciding his actions. Now, at the same time, there are prudential aspects, right? So, if you take on an activity like prostitution, right, where of course there are serious moral problems with it. But at the same time, when judging how public authorities should deal with the activity, right? The extent to which it should be repressed or regulated, what the consequences are to be, who should get a penalty for being involved in it, or who should not get a penalty for being involved in it. That raises a number of what we would call prudential questions, right? Aquinas wouldn't exactly use this very same language, but we would now call it this. Why? Because you may, I mean, the moral goals, they have to be there. So it's not okay to say, oh, it's all fine. I mean, if it's a sort of an extreme libertarian perspective where you say, I mean, if there's voluntary consent, it's all fine. No, that's certainly not from a Catholic social teaching perspective, an acceptable way to look at the issue. But at the same time, I mean, on the other extreme, we would have something like, okay, this is to be morally condemned. Therefore, absolute repression is certainly the way to go, right? Because this is morally undesirable. Therefore, we punish to the full extent that we can. So, and there comes an element of prudential evaluation, right? So, it may be that in certain circumstances, and there, as Philip was saying, this is necessarily provisional. It may be better to regulate the activity of prostitution. For example, not to have criminal penalties on prostitutes, right? To have different types of regulatory frameworks on the activity because of the social consequences that are expected to arise from, for example, more strict regulatory arrangements. Now, of course, this will depend. This will not apply to everything. So there will not be, if we're talking about abortion, for example, it will not. It cannot be framed the same way. But to a number of activities which have, from a moral perspective, problematic implications, the judgment from Catholic social teaching is usually very nuanced in the sense that it's neither, although in some cases it is, but it's not the standard, an absolute prohibition. It is a judgment of an obligation to consider certain moral concerns and certain moral goals, but then having a margin of decision which will depend on the contributions from other sciences, on the specific political and social and economic circumstances, and so that can be compatible with different approaches without necessarily violating the core pillars of Catholic social teaching. And that's also how we can, I think, explain without sort of without running away from those difficult questions, the evolution of the church's own position on many of these matters over the time, right? It's of course it's easy to fall prey to sort of hypocrisy of just saying, I mean, the times change, therefore the positions change. But again, if we go back to what I mentioned in my first intervention about the sort of the long-term continuity of Catholic social thought, I think we can discern that there is, in many cases, a long-standing, perhaps permanent concern with the same moral goals, but then that there's an element of prudential judgment. And so, for example, as economic knowledge evolves, as biological knowledge evolves, as sociological knowledge evolves, as legal knowledge evolves, then the implications of those long-standing permanent moral concerns will be compatible with different types of public policy. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. In our perspective, the contrary. It is something that should be embraced as long as it is guided by a very clear understanding of those guiding moral principles.
And yeah, and I think there are two, well, probably more than two aspects to this, but two aspects of this are, no, so sometimes a prohibition of something through government policy creates effects which are actually worse than the problem you're trying to solve. I think that was in Aquinas' mind in relation to prostitution, and we can think of a number of areas, such as when gambling is prohibited, when alcohol has been prohibited, and so on, where that has been a problem. But the other question is that, or the other aspect of this is that God does give us free will, and He didn't give the authority to people on earth to create a theocracy where He didn't actually want to suppress our free will Himself. Now, if I use that free will to seriously undermine somebody's human dignity, then that's a different matter. But I can't actually really realize my perfection and truly realize my relationship with God unless I'm actually able to choose what is good, and putting aside all the problems that you have with the centralization of power, with simply prohibiting everything, which we see in other countries, perhaps where the theocracy is governed by the principles of a different religion. But putting that aside, that God didn't want to give the power to human persons to suppress free will when He didn't wish to do that Himself.
Yeah, that makes sense. I hear the cure or the medicine can't be worse than the disease, but also this need for respecting our ability to discern through our conscience, through the application of our conscience to how we ought to live our lives, obviously within reason, and for the conduciveness of society. And so that actually gets to my next kind of question: is this idea of the common good is not foreign to economics as a science, but as I read through some of the economic tradition, Adam Smith and Hayek, it's about self-interest and the application of self-interest to, right? Like the propensity to truck, barter, and trade. We do not intend the facilitation of the common good. We're only looking out for our own interest, but through the invisible hand, we come to benefit all of society writ large. On the flip side of that question is now Secretary of State Marco Rubio, back in 2018 or 2019, proposed something he called common good capitalism, which to my mind implies that capitalism, or the market system by itself, as championed by Hayek, Mises, Smith, Ricardo, does not care for the common good by itself, but you need some sort of infusion of, say, like a Catholic social teaching, which I think is now Secretary of State Rubio at the time was trying to get at. It needs to be infused into our thinking, because economics by itself does not produce those outcomes or take into consideration these various questions. And so I think the question is, what is added to policymaking when you add in the Catholic social tradition? And I would also, maybe as a secondary question to that, is does economics produce certain normative outcomes, which is to say, does its own, from within its own science and its own presuppositions, does it foreclose certain outcomes that might be problematic from a Catholic perspective, but are the sort of necessary logical outflowing of the premises and the tools that it uses?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Shall I? That's quite a lot to unpack there. So let me try to do it as simply as possible. So, instinctively, I didn't really like where Marco Rubio ended up, but there was certainly some truth in what he was saying, and I think the first thing to do is to just try and understand what is meant by the common good, because I don't think this is a well understood phrase, and probably discussion of this would take an hour or two. But let me try and simplify as much as I can. So I think when people very often on the left of politics say, we don't want capitalism because that just promotes the good of the individual. We want people to think about the common good instead. they're kind of thinking about that in a utilitarian way of the sort of promoting the general welfare, the greatest good for the greatest number, and so on. Now, the common good in Catholic thinking is quite different from that. It's about creating the conditions in which all members of society can reach fulfillment. And in fact, the word that's used in the non-English translations of Gaudium et Spes, from which that definition comes, can reach their perfection. So there's something there about what is common and also what is good. And of course, the Catholic Church has an objective understanding of what is good. It's not just a matter of opinion. And there are certain common conditions, it's argued. You might talk about this in terms of the political common good, that we need our political system to establish in order that we can all live that life which takes us closer to God. Now, I think Rubio probably underestimates the extent to which a free economy, and I'd use that word rather than a capitalist system, where people do broadly behave in their own self-interest, but of course that self-interest being attenuated by moral concerns, the needs of others. People don't just behave in an entirely selfish way unless governments force them to take account of the needs of others. They cooperate together to achieve shared goals in a whole range of different ways. But of course, even where people do within market economies try and serve the interests, their own interests, as Adam Smith points out, they very often serve the interests of others too. And just to use his example, he talks about how if the member of the village wants his dinner, he doesn't talk to the butcher about what he wants, but about his own interest in selling him the sausages and so on. And actually, he'd be rather greedy if the person who wanted the sausages did try to persuade the butcher to give him the sausages, rather than persuade the butcher to act in his own self-interest by selling the customer the sausages. And the neat thing about a market economy, as Smith points out, is that you can't really you can't really serve your own interests without also serving the interests of others. We could have a discussion about the difference between selfishness and self-interest, but just let me note that where I think Rubio had a point is that we perhaps don't really talk enough about how the mechanisms of government ought to exist to promote an economy, to promote a society of virtue. But I would say that the first thing there is for the government to get its own house in order, to stop borrowing large sums of money, to operate a sound monetary policy, not to develop systems of crony capitalism where regulatory bureaucracies act in the interests of large corporations and so on. So whilst I think Rubio had a point, I'm not sure that I agree with his overall diagnosis, nor with many of his specific remedies.
If I can add on that, just three aspects. First, on the common good, and agreeing with everything Philip said, I would add there's also an Aristotelian dimension or an Aristotelian flavor to the notion of to the Catholic notion of the common good, in the sense that we often in contemporary times have a sort of utilitarian reading of the common good, right? And that's not really the point. Of course, there are consequentialist considerations which are relevant, and hence, for example, the importance of economics as on the technical side of things. So they are not irrelevant, but at the core of the notion of the common good is this notion of human flourishing. So the idea having a society where conditions are in place that allow each person, each family, to develop and to flourish in a way which is not really measurable in a quantitative sense. So it's not you have a higher GDP or you have a higher income, thereby you're flourishing more or we're getting closer to the common good. there's a material side to it which is relevant, so it's not irrelevant, but it's not the core. Secondly, and related with this, I think the whole discussion about self-interest, selfishness, that would be a long conversation in itself. But I think an interesting expression that some classical liberals used, which is enlightened self-interest, which I think is particularly useful in this regard. So it is self-interest. It is emphasizing that self-interest is essential in any complex society, in a way as an enlarged mechanism for social cooperation, right? So through markets, we cooperate with people we don't even know, right? And self-interest plays an important role in that. But at the same time, and again, establishing a contrast with a sort of with some extreme libertarian views or purely utilitarian views, it requires that the self-interest be guided by what we, in a Thomist sense, could say right reason. So it has to be guided, it ought to be guided towards the right goals, and hence I think the enlightened self-interest expression is a positive one. So if you have a self-interest which is directed solely at maximizing income or at maximizing profit, then we will have a problem. But at the same time, self-interest is this important component. Thirdly, I would add, and this to touch upon Rubio's point, which I also partially agree, is this enlightened self-interest will, in principle, not be able to operate in a total vacuum. So it requires moral, legal, even political frameworks which are conducive to allowing this human flourishing, and which is another way of saying which allow the pursuit of the common good. And in that sense, I think it is also a mistake, and also going to the last point in your question, if we simply assume that market activity, regardless of any other aspects of the moral framework, of the political framework, of the legal framework, will necessarily create the right conditions for society to allow the pursuit of the common good, and thereby, I think these two elements have to be combined. So enlightened self-interest, but also sort of a continuous development of a proper moral, legal, and political framework, which is conducive to the operation of that enlightened self-interest in a way that is compatible and enhances pursuit of the common good.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of that, I think to me the idea that he was going for, that I quite like, is it's the critique or an alternative to what's sometimes called in America, I don't know what it is across the pond, but free market fundamentalism, or the assumption that what's good for business is good for the average people of America. And this is not to say that democracy is indefeasible, voice of God, but if election results in America and across Europe are any indication, that is just not true, as in terms of people seem to not think that. So despite the positive progress in improving material conditions that you both outlined in your introduction, there's a certain sense in which things either have gotten worse, actually, or at least have strongly perceived to get worse in various ways that treating what's good for business is good for the country doesn't hit. And so I think that's what he was getting at. And, common good capitalism, whether or not you like that term, it's, a political or rhetorical device. I want to now pivot towards some of the policy areas that you both touch on in the book. And, this is a great edited collection, including chapters by friends like Sam Gregg and Jay Richards, longtime professors and friends of ISI. And there's a lot there: education, healthcare, climate, migration, globalization, finance, business ethics, and also sort of intellectual history and the development of Catholic social thought, its implications on economics. I'll only touch on a few of them, just for the sake of leaving something to be desired or to be pursued by our listeners. And I do recommend this text very much. But Andre, I want to start with something that I think, as Pope Francis is recently deceased and we now have Pope Leo, something that was probably a hallmark that was not totally new in the history of Catholic social thought is care for the climate and care for the earth. That seemed widely regarded as a big part of Pope Francis's legacy, is this, whether it's new, but renewed attention towards issues of climate. So from a policy perspective, I'm wondering if you could touch on what Catholic social doctrine gets or adds to the discussion in terms of framing public policy that is currently missing from a lot of the debates.
Yeah, that's a very important area, and I'm sure Philip will be able also to add on this. First, with a more historical and sort of philosophical / theological point, I'd definitely say renewed interest rather than a new interest, because it's actually a long-standing topic, and the fact that in that you have this notion of human beings as having dominion over nature. The Catholic understanding of this is not human beings have dominion, thereby they can do anything they want and destroy things and whatever. Quite the contrary. This places human beings in a position of special responsibility, right? Of caretakers. And I mean, even from a political philosophy perspective, the very idea of conservation, right? That's at the heart, not just of the Catholic perspective, but more broadly of a number of political philosophies, including conservatism, but not just conservatism. So I would say that, I mean, there's of course what Pope Francis attempted to do, and we can have different perspectives on how well this was accomplished on a number of fronts. But the concern, I think, was clear. A very valuable concern was bringing back or approaching the Catholic concerns over these issues to the contemporary debate, right? And I think in that sense, again, this is a renewed attention paid to these issues, not so much a new doctrine or a new, or even less, a new area of application. Now, second part of this is, from a technical perspective, many of these issues, say, what should we do about climate change, or what should be done about water management, or what should be done about deforestation, are extremely complex issues, which involve a number of sciences, which involve also a number of prudential concerns. So lots of these issues, they involve not just technical complexity, but they involve also trade-offs, right? So developed countries polluted quite a lot to get to where they are. Are we now to say to developing countries they cannot do those same things for global reason A or B, which may be very valuable? And if that is the case, and perhaps it is, then what are we going to offer in return? How is that going to be offered in return? So this is then linked also with international aid, which is another important topic, and so on and so forth. So I would clearly place the issue itself as a long-standing concern in terms of Catholic social thought. I would highly praise the effort Pope Francis made in terms of sort of putting light on and attention, renewed attention, and saying that people who are interested in Catholic social thought should devote more attention to this. I would then also add that the technical and political and prudential complexity of many of these issues is one area, to link with something Philip mentioned in the beginning, where it's particularly important to be cautious and prudent in the analysis themselves, and to refrain from trying to have sort of an absolute position and say, well, the only position compatible with Catholic social thought on water management is this technical solution, and everything else is morally impermissible. I think if there is one area, or one of the areas where this is where one should be more careful not to fall into this kind of trap, is precisely environmental issues. And just to conclude, but this should also not be a reason to avoid serious discussion of them. So if one is just going to say, oh, this is highly complex, so let's not bother with it, again, I would say this is avoiding what is a moral obligation to actually take seriously these conservation issues, care for the common home, our common home, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so, I mean, Catholic social teaching documents really, ever since 1971, have addressed this issue of the environment. Pope Paul VI made some quite dramatic predictions, which I think people could argue have come true back in 1971. What Pope Francis did really was develop a sustained analysis, which was complete and coherent about these environmental questions, which earlier popes had dealt with perhaps in part. So Pope John Paul II talked a lot about the problem of having rather than being. In other words, always wanting to consume more and feel better by consuming more, and that this was destructive of the environment. Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II and Pope Francis also linked the wider environmental issues to what they described as human ecology. So what sense does it make to say you care about the environment if you believe in the euthanasia, by which doctors kill older people, or you believe in abortion or artificial methods of conception, and so on. And in a sense, I think Pope Francis joined these together coherently and created, I mean, when I teach this on our MA in Catholic social teaching, I teach it he created a triangle that, you need really a process of conversion. That's what Pope Francis was asking for in relation to these environmental issues. That as human persons, we have a relationship with God, we have right relationships with each other, and that we have right relationships with the environmental goods that God created. And we respect those, apart from for no other reason, because God created them and gave them to us as a gift, and we don't disrespect gifts. Yeah. And there's then therefore a relationship between creation and God, and God created the natural environment. And this is a unified whole, and we must think about it this way. And if we go through, if you like, that process of conversion, then we will start to give environmental issues their proper due, both in our personal actions, how we operate in businesses, how we operate in civil society, parish life, and so on, but also how we act in public policy terms. And as Andre said, that's when things get most difficult. I've critiqued Laudato Si from the perspective of it not emphasizing sufficiently the importance of the right to property and the respect for private property for helping ensure that we conserve environmental goods. And also, I won't say I've critiqued this, but I think Pope Francis, given was a big interest of his in any case, and is clearly a big interest of Pope Leo's, and was of John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, they should have unified, I think, to a greater degree, discussions of the importance of peace and the absence of war with environmental concerns, because there's nothing more destructive of the environment than war. But as Andre said, you're sitting around a COP table, and all the parties at one of these big international conferences on the environment decide that they're going to maybe rescind some previous ban on drilling in the Arctic or whatever it might be. I'm just making this example up, and instead implement a 15% worldwide carbon tax. One wouldn't expect the Vatican to say, oh no, that carbon tax should be 11% rather than 15%, and you should have done this rather than that. That needs a certain degree of economic expertise, which of course requires also the acceptance of the goals of nurturing the natural environment. Pope Francis was very clear that he chose his words carefully here. He's being criticised by Americans who you might describe as people who don't necessarily agree with the climate science or agree with the climate science but don't believe in economic interventionism. But Pope Francis was very clear. He used the words, there is a strong consensus, I think it was, among scientists that global warming is happening and it's caused by human beings. No, that's an incontrovertible statement, even if you don't yourself accept the science. And I think it is the job of the Pope to respond to the signs of the times and make these judgments based on the scientific consensus he sees. Maybe in 40 years' time, we'll see that scientific consensus was wrong and therefore some different judgments can be made.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially emphasizing what we had discussed towards the top of the episode about we have an overarching moral framework, and then we need the technical science of economics, of policymaking to adjudicate what we should do based on that overarching goal. Another one, and I know neither of you wrote the chapter on this, but on healthcare, this to me is one where conservatives, and maybe we'll just, for the sake of our discussion, just treat Christianity and conservatism as shorthand for being, one-to-one the same thing. But at least American conservatives, this is American conservatives, in my opinion, have not at least had a public stance on healthcare that is like a plan. And maybe not having a plan actually is a plan, and that's the way to go. Is we shouldn't have a healthcare plan and leave it up to the natural order to figure out what it will look like in local communities. So that might actually be, the lack of a plan is because central planning is a problem. But across the Atlantic, y'all have more concrete arrangements. And I'd be curious what we might learn from Europe on healthcare in its different manifestations. I think UK and then also Germany was sort of a model, and how that plays into questions of what we owe each other in terms of human dignity as a sort of a basic level of healthcare, which is like it's a good and a service. But also, I think there's debate in America, maybe over across the pond as well, about whether healthcare is a human right. And I don't know what y'all make of that, but from a Catholic perspective, what do we need to learn in America, at least for the right, rhetorically and politically, to have some sort of something to offer the public?
Philip, you want to?
Okay, yeah. If you don't mind, I think it's easier to start with what we need to learn in the United Kingdom, because that might help Americans understand what they don't need to learn from Europe. So when I'm giving talks about Catholic social teaching, maybe in Globalization or something like that, you do, of course, change minds and people change their views and they go away with some facts that they didn't realize before. The one talk I sometimes give, I give a talk on healthcare and Catholic social teaching, and I think it's the one talk I give where people then just begin to think about the issue entirely differently, because a joke was made about a former Chancellor of the Exchequer in England, United Kingdom, that the NHS, the National Health Service, is actually our national religion, and yet. For 2,000 years before the NHS, well, maybe not for that long in the UK, of course. How was healthcare largely provided? Well, it was largely provided in a religious setting, and all of the great hospitals that we now know had religious origins, and many of them go back, several hundred years and still exist today. After the Reformation, the religious provision of healthcare in the UK declined, but then there was a huge revival in Edinburgh, especially, and in Scotland, again, led by religious people, by and large. And we in the United Kingdom cherish the fact that we have Catholic schools where students are funded in those Catholic schools to the same extent as they are funded in state schools. And yet the same people never question whether the state should provide and finance the whole of healthcare in an entirely secular, non-religious setting. And yet, I would argue that there is a very important religious dimension to the provision of healthcare, just as there's an ethical dimension, just as there's a very important religious and ethical dimension to the provision of education. So we should maybe apply the same principles to both. And yes, I think that the church now really does accept or teach that all should have the right to a particular level of healthcare. Now, there's a whole range of ways in which that can be achieved. The state could, for example, just finance the healthcare for relatively poor people, whilst other people finance it for themselves. It could be provided entirely through private institutions, but financed by the state, and so on. So we could look across the English Channel to models that we have in Germany and Holland and Switzerland, and those models allow for a plurality of provision, including religious providers, financed on the same basis as a state. Now, the danger of that, as state providers, the danger of that is that if the state is providing the finance, ultimately maybe the state actually starts regulating and calling the tune and regulating even religious healthcare, as it has in many countries, according to the same principles as it provides healthcare in its own institutions. So maybe requiring religious institutions to perform abortions and that type of thing. So I would argue that the state should have the minimal involvement possible, whilst ensuring that those who are less well off, without question, have their healthcare financed, insofar as it's not financed by charitable and mutual means, but by the state. But while still respecting the ability of anybody who has their healthcare financed by the state to choose between institutions, some of which we would hope would be religious institutions of healthcare provision.
Yeah, I'll just add on that, and Philip is more of an expert on this field than I am, but I would add that it's also important to bear into consideration in terms of the provision of healthcare, plurality of providers. So one important thing, whatever the nature of the system, is that it allows, namely, religious providers and Catholic providers, and that it then allows these providers to be consistent with their own, let's say, religious framework, of course, within medical good practice, and there will be always areas of tension. And we go back to initial point between sort of the moral permanent goals and then the technical evolution. But I think this point about allowing religious providers and religious assistance, for example, even in non-religious providers, which is also an important topic, particularly in the West nowadays, including in the US. I think this is also an important dimension, and perhaps one of the dimensions where Catholic teaching has more to say, that is less dependent on those technical dimensions in terms of health policy and health economics, where there is, I think, a greater plurality of policy options which might be potentially compatible with Catholic teaching.
And just to say that in Rerum Novarum, because we're talking about that a lot at the moment because of Pope Leo XIV, it could not have been clearer that the Pope Leo wanted these wanted the family and also mutual institutions of welfare provision to be as independent of the state as possible, that the state might well step in if people's rights, fundamental rights were at stake and so on, but the state shouldn't use the fact that it helps finance healthcare or education for that matter through independent institutions to then try to control those institutions.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. One I would say is above my pay grade, but I found both of your answers to be edifying and sort of intellectually interesting, something to think more about and try and learn more about. At least in America, healthcare to me seems very complicated, and I don't understand how it works. So even though I was maybe critical at the start of my question that conservatives or people on my side don't have an answer. I say that not having an answer. So thank you both. I do want to pivot to the last sort of policy area that was particularly interesting to me, and this one's a very hot one in the United States. Really, it's two. It's globalization, not only as policy but also as posture, and related strongly to that, probably most strongly to that, is migration. In the United States right now, it seems to me that everyone on every side of the question is picking up the mantle of Catholicism to whether or not explicitly justify, at least give a defense of what they're doing, whether that's mass deportation or call it repatriation, the Ordo Amoris, or on the flip side of that is either trying to subvert or enjoin or stop various immigration restriction and provisions to remove people from the country. How much, and I know, Philip, you wrote the chapter on globalization, so maybe you could start here, but how much of globalization and these sorts of not just policy questions, but these larger conceptual ones, how much of these are prudential, and how much of it is sort of more clear cut and dry as to the Catholic moral teaching? But then also as a sort of follow up to that is, could you give us a bit of a framework for how we could think and potentially act on some of these issues as they're alive today?
Yeah, okay. I'll end with a point I'll make about the rhetoric, which is what worries me as much as anything else, actually. There's no question that the issue of globalization is a prudential issue, and we know that because different social encyclicals have taken different perspectives. So the encyclical of Pope Paul VI, Populorum Progressio, about underdeveloped nations, was somewhat critical of the idea of free trade, certainly didn't use the word globalization. And then in 1991, Pope John Paul II talked about how economies could actually only grow by integrating with the rest of the world, and that perhaps he didn't quote his own encyclical, the older encyclicals back, but he said perhaps we, I think, meaning the intellectual community in general, had misjudged this in earlier decades. And of course, Pope Francis has expressed, I won't say both views at the same time, but he's been both critical of globalization and some of its manifestations, as well as praising it. Now, my own view, as you will know, is that globalization, along with a number of other things which happen concurrently, including the growth in the number of democracies, a reduction in the number of wars, improvement of the rule of law in a number of countries, has been responsible for a dramatic reduction in poverty and a huge reduction in global inequality in the last 40 years. There are some economists, but this is definitely disputed, who would argue that the poor in some richer countries, most notably America, I think, the United States, have suffered as a result. That's disputed. But even economists who think that don't argue that America should be protectionist. They argue instead that the US should put in appropriate policies to help retraining, help mobility of labour and so on, so that people who may have suffered from globalisation might be able to find alternative forms of employment. I always pose the question when I talk about globalisation, whatever problem you find with globalisation, the answer does not lie in protectionism. It lies in some other solution. And when it comes to migration, I think most economists would accept that the issues are a little bit different, because there's a whole set of social circumstances surrounding the movement of people, which doesn't necessarily relate to the movement of goods, capital, and services. And of course, countries do have the right to control their own borders. There is concern in the UK and the US about illegal migration, but that shouldn't be used as an excuse to not have a welcoming attitude towards those migrants who are fleeing persecution, fleeing war, or indeed want to improve their economic circumstances. And certainly, one should be very careful about the rhetoric. There is a great deal of difference between saying we have a problem here because we haven't controlled, and really that's the fault of the receiving country, we haven't administered migration well enough to ensure that that it's all done in a proper legal framework and that everybody has their rights and appropriate papers and so on. And so we must just look at that and be careful in relation to how we develop our migration policies. But in principle, we welcome migration, and we want to ensure that those who have a terrible life elsewhere can thrive here. And using the kind of protectionist, anti-internationalist rhetoric, which I hear in a number of countries in Europe, but perhaps also in the United States. Now, ultimately, we are called to love our neighbour, and our neighbour is whoever we have got. God's providence leads us to have an encounter, and I'll just finish by saying that there's a marvellous paragraph in Fratelli Tutti which reminds those who are becoming too parochial, too focused on their own local communities, that if they do that, they won't flourish as human persons, and their communities won't flourish. They must look outwards to the world. It also reminds, though, those of us who perhaps spend much too much time travelling and looking outwards to the world and talking about the wonders of globalization, not to forget our own communities within which we must help flourishing and help promote fraternity, which involves real proper relationships, which can only be developed on a local level. Pope Francis reminds us that we do both, and I think that's a really important reminder, if you like, to both sides, to both sides of the argument.
Yeah, let me add on this, and agreeing with Philip's points, two aspects, one on globalization and the other on migration. First on globalization, and I agree, I mean, particularly over the last few decades, but in some way, in a more limited sense, in terms of the world from the Industrial Revolution onwards, and maybe the last 4 or 5 decades more globally, globalization and trade flows and investment flows have been extremely important for raising lots and lots, millions and millions and millions of people out of poverty. And this is certainly very, very important. At the same time, I think it's unfortunate, and I think the political climate and the backlash we are seeing now in the US and in other places in the West is partly against what I would call globalism. So the development of some global institutions. I'm thinking about some aspects of the UN, some aspects of, say, the World Bank, some aspects of other global institutions in a non-democratic, supranational manner, often dominated and captured by some extreme ideological elements and imposing their agenda on different countries. Often they're very anti-religious, anti-Christian agenda across the board. And I think that has generated a backlash, which in some ways is a healthy backlash, that people are rejecting this. But I think there's also a risk that, as the expression goes, we are throwing the baby with the bathwater, right? So because there's a notion of these global institutions, then everything which is about openness and about the rest of the world must necessarily be bad, and therefore we must close ourselves, right? And severe and close trade links and so on and so forth. So I think there's a part of this which is, from my perspective, a healthy development, a healthy backlash, but there's also the risk that this is extended to globalization itself, and I think that would be really unfortunate, and I think that's an ongoing task for all of us to try to be involved and deal with as best as possible. On migration, I would, where there is another area where there's certainly an important role for prudential judgment, and there are clashing values here, so there is a right, in Catholic teaching, there is a right to migrate, but there is also a right for a country and community to regulate its own borders in accordance with pursuit of the common good in that community. I think the key word here is integration. And integration, I think, is a concept that links and allows us to make better prudential judgments, both in terms of the receiving community. I mean, clearly, outcomes are better for the receiving community if incoming migrants are better able to integrate in the community, not just in the market, in the community. And again, that's one area where it's not, I think, wise to say just what is good for businesses is good for society necessarily. That's one dimension, not the only dimension, but also integration from the perspective of the migrants themselves, right? So we certainly don't want migratory policies which then generate ghettos in receiving countries, which generate social conflict. So I think the answer to the proper way to address these often conflicting values that come into play in migration is to give greater prominence to integration rather than falling into the trap of we're all for open borders, all come without any concern, or enough, we don't want anybody. It's, I think, judging based both from the perspective of the receiving community and from the perspective of the well-being and flourishing of the migrants themselves through the standard and a threshold of integration.
Could I just add something to that? So, I mean, Pope Francis himself has been very critical of international organizations of the type that Andre mentions, imposing Western pro-abortion agendas. And those agendas, I should say, go way beyond the purposes for which these institutions were set up. And Pope Francis, he's both his message and the particular language he used in his last address to the diplomatic corps, I think is absolutely brilliant on this issue. So that was at the beginning of the calendar year, I think. I'd go further than Andre, though, and say I think there's a real danger of protectionists in the US and continental Europe. We don't really have that movement yet in the UK, of actually throwing out the baby and keeping the bathwater, because you can't control these international organizations, and you don't control them by being protectionist. So we might end up with all these international organizations whilst actually throwing away free trade.
It's a fair point.
Which is the baby, the UN, the bathwater, or the pro-abortion agenda of the UN, the bathwater we'll still have. I think it's really interesting to listen to Ronald Reagan's final speech as president, a love letter to immigrants, and also his debate with President Bush in the primaries in 1980, because I think that demonstrates how you can get the language right, and you can say all the right things. The four words Pope Francis used were welcome, protect, accompany, and integrate. And you can get all that language right, and but you can still say, well, I'm sorry, we do have to control immigration, or we do have to ensure our processes are better so that we don't have illegal immigration, etc. But the language, I think, is really important here. It demonstrates that you have a positive disposition towards migrants, even if there are particular policy issues on which two reasonable people might differ.
I think that makes sense. It's it's actually a pretty narrow passage in the sense of there are two, what do you call it? Two errors, and you have to find that golden mean. But again, still, it's a matter of prudential considerations, what that means in any particular time. I went and watched after I saw the footnote on the Reagan-Bush immigration debate in 1980. And it's a pretty far cry of 45 years later.
Yeah.
We're at a very, very different place, not just on that issue, but politically, just that we sound very different at least as a Republican Party. Not that ISI is affiliated with the Republican Party, where we are not. But for conservatives, it's a very different thing. I was going to say something else too. Well, I forget that. That's okay. I have one last question because we've been going for some time, and I appreciate it. I think sitting in the background of all of this is a term that we've not used or identified yet. We've talked about common good and self-interest and the tradition and whatnot, but human dignity in economic and social relations. So I think as a closing question, how would you encourage our listeners and viewers to think about how human dignity can be a frame for addressing public policy, as opposed to, I think what we have talked about is a more utilitarian and materialist impulse, which exists both on the left and on certain parts of the American and probably the European right as well. I think probably many listeners will bristle or would say like I already reject utilitarian materialism in my calculations, but yeah, well, instead of thinking about policy consequences or outcomes, which are important, but use human dignity as a frame because it's both a Catholic idea, but it also is beyond Catholicism in a way. It's something that any bearer of reason, any human being could ascribe to. That question makes sense?
Yeah. Okay, so if I go first, maybe, and then Andre can have the very last word, right? So, so human dignity is actually often talked about even in Catholic social teaching in rather, shall we say, material terms, and that's important. Everybody by virtue of the fact that they are a human being should have shelter, clothing, food, and so on, so that they can live in dignity. Now, that doesn't really lead to that's not really a great deal of help when it comes to public policy, in a sense, except that the state should be there to ensure that these things happen. There is a division, if you like, between left and those who believe in free markets as to the extent to which the state should be involved in providing these things and the extent to which markets should be involved in providing these things. But I would take it a little bit further and relate this maybe to the crisis and onto non-material issues, so that the crisis which people believe exists in many Western societies, a crisis of meaning to begin with, which I think we believe can be fulfilled by the love of God and the church, but also just the crisis of relationships, loneliness, and so on. And so I'll relate it, I think, in these final remarks to the two Catholic principles of solidarity and subsidiarity, which people believe are often in conflict, but I don't think they are. So the virtue of solidarity requires us to have a deep desire for the good of the other. It's related really to love and to act on that desire, to assist others in our community who need our help in various ways. So to create a true, because we should express this worldwide, a true worldwide brotherhood of man, if you like. However, our limitations as human persons and our need to really have relationships to flourish mean that to authentically promote human dignity and the relationships that we need for human dignity, we do need small-scale action, which starts in the family. So the first job of the state really is to ensure that families can flourish, and then ensure that wider societies, which we believe should be independent, healthcare institutions, schools, other civil society institutions, and so on, and can flourish. Now, some of these might be great big worldwide international institutions, but many of them may well be local as well. And the provision of welfare, which grew in the late 19th century in the UK and the US, these organizations were mutual organizations, and they were based on the principle of fraternity. So as well as providing welfare, people would actually try to get to know each other, to really understand their real needs, so that they could flourish. If they're unemployed, did they need help with training, or did they need help getting a job, or did they just need material support for a while? And so a state which supports institutions starting from the family and ensuring that people using their free will can promote the virtue of solidarity, which then radiates outwards, I think is what we really need to promote human dignity and proper relationships.
Yeah, I would add perhaps from going away a little bit from the perspective of the state. And I think the concept of human dignity is also particularly important now in terms of one aspect Philip mentioned, which is meaning and the priorities. I mean, and this to a large extent, I think, regardless of political ideology or party affiliation in contemporary societies. So I'm thinking about sort of the cult of the young and the healthy, right? And social media, material goods, sort of these artificial worlds we now increasingly live in, right? And how it is easy, and I think I would argue that religion and specifically Catholicism is very important in trying to prevent this, is in attributing meaning to these sort of artificial worlds that we create, right? Whereas meaning, proper meaning, if we attribute, I think the proper value and centrality to human dignity is to be found much more in things like taking care of the sick, taking care of the elderly, being with them. I mean, it's not just taking care in the sense of assisting, of providing material means, but sort of devoting our most precious resource, which is time and effort, right? I mean, also for the young, but I mean, usually caring for the young is not as problematic because babies are cute and most people tend to sympathize. But things which are, I mean, unpleasant often on an aesthetic, purely aesthetic dimension. But I think often if we look back, and again, to go back to human dignity, what the most meaningful moments were in our lives, they were not probably the day we did some extra work, or the day we made more money, or the day we got more likes on Instagram, or our video on TikTok got most views, but they may be the days we spent taking care of a loved one or a friend, right? So I think this also on a personal dimension, Catholic thought is important in terms of, I'm not saying it's the only way to do this, but I think it's a very important tradition of thought in terms of allowing recentering our lives on the concept of human dignity. And all that implies at a practical level in terms of how we conduct our daily lives and how we define the meaning in our daily lives.
And we haven't mentioned abortion, which maybe we should do, because in a world where 1/4 of babies, well, in the UK, I don't know what the figures are in the US or Portugal, but in the UK, 1/4 of all conceptions end with an abortion, which is obviously a tragedy for the babies themselves and an affront to their dignity on a scale which is unimaginable, but also how we've come to have a society where mothers who may be very uncomfortable doing this, who can look into the mind of somebody who chooses. So there's a cultural problem here as well as a public policy problem.
The culture of death and the throwaway culture, something that's been harped on and
phrase, yeah.
Inveighed against by many popes in recent years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was going to say, after Andre's intervention, on that happy note, and then Philip took us down a different path, but that's okay. Anyways, I'm very grateful to you both for joining for this amount of time and talking about your book, Catholic Social Thought, the Market and Public Policy. Insofar as it's my personal goal to help provide good reading material for listeners and viewers, I'm very alarmed by reports that college students do not read anymore, or some of them have gone to college without reading and a full book all the way through in their entire K through 12 education. If you can believe that in the United States, it's a little bit unbelievable. But insofar as that's potentially true, I really want to see people read. So try to provide good reading material, and I recommend this one. So, gentlemen, if people want to follow more of your work and potentially read other things that you've written either together or separately, keep up with what you're doing, where would you recommend they look? Andre and then Philip.
Thanks. Well, first, couple of resources. We have the book is part of a project, the Catholic Social Thought project, which has its own website. And in addition to the contents of the book, which we have smaller blog texts and other resources. So I would recommend that for people who are interested in exploring more this tradition. As Philip also already mentioned, we both take part in an MA in Catholic Social Teaching at St. Mary's University in London. So that's also something that people who may be interested may want to look on. And then on a personal perspective, I recommend people who are interested in learning more, look at my website you can Google my website at the Catholic University of Portugal, and also my Google Scholar profile. And you'll find more information about publications and interests and teaching and so on there. And thank you very much, Tom.
Yeah. Okay. So on www.catholicsocialthought.org.uk, you can actually find all of the chapters in the book, except for the moment the introduction, although that will be sorted out soon. And if your students don't like reading books, then there are a series of 6-minute videos on the on the topic as well as regular blog posts, and they can sign up or follow on Twitter as appropriate. And in addition to that, when I was at the Institute of Economic Affairs, we published a book, it's 10 years ago now, Catholic Social Thought and the Market Economy, the 2014 edition rather than the 2007 edition, which covers a range of other topics which are not covered in the more recent book. So there's some ideas that you can follow up.
Oh, companion, wonderful. Yeah, gentlemen, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.